Never thought a piece of paper could split a family clean in half. But then, I never thought my wife would hand me a suitcase and tell me she'd already changed the locks, not while my father-in-law was still warm in the ground. My name is Nathan Quill, and this is the story of the worst week of my life. And somehow also the week I finally understood what my father-in-law had been trying to tell me for years. People called him Pops. Not just me. Everybody did. His actual name was Raymond Aldrich. But somewhere around 1987, one of his warehouse workers started calling him Pops because he'd bring homemade sandwiches for the crew on Friday afternoons, and the name stuck. By the time I met him, 23 years into my marriage with his daughter Celeste, I don't think half the people at his church even knew his real name. I met Celeste at 24. She was sharp, funny, the kind of person who remembered every detail you'd ever told her. I fell hard. Her father liked me from the first dinner. Or at least, he was kind enough to pretend he did, which, knowing him, might have been the same thing. Pops ran a small trucking company he'd built from a single flatbed in 1991. Nothing glamorous. 4 trucks, a small yard on the edge of town, and a reputation for never missing a delivery. He wasn't wealthy in any showy sense. He drove a 12-year-old Ford. He packed his own lunch. But he was comfortable. Quietly, steadily comfortable. The kind of man who'd paid off his house in his 50s and never mentioned it again. Celeste knew this. And over the years, I started to realize that knowing it was doing something to her. I want to be fair here because she wasn't always the person she became. In our early years, she worked. She had a job in hotel management that she was genuinely good at, and she cared about it. But then her mother passed. Pops' wife, a quiet woman named Bet, who I never got to know well enough. And something shifted in Celeste. She quit her job 6 months after the funeral. Said she needed time. I understood that. Grief is real, and I wasn't going to push her. But time stretched. 1 year became 2. 2 became 4. She took up a decorating hobby that cost more than it produced. She started talking about her father's company differently, not as something he'd built, but as something she was eventually owed. Pops never said anything about it directly to me. But I noticed the way his jaw tightened when she talked about the business at Sunday dinners. He'd changed the subject. Refill glasses. Find something to do in the kitchen. I was working in commercial real estate at the time. Not a high earner, but steady. We had a mortgage. We had 2 cars. We weren't struggling, but we weren't flush either. And whenever money got tight, Celeste would make comments. Not arguments exactly, more like observations. Dad really should bring us in more. Or, it's not like he has anyone else. Her brother, a man named Scott who'd moved to Denver a decade earlier and called maybe 4 times a year, was apparently not a concern. I never agreed with those comments out loud. I think that bothered her. The summer before Pops died, he got the diagnosis. Congestive heart failure, advanced enough that the doctors were talking timelines. He took it the way he took most things. Quietly, practically. He made calls. He had meetings with his attorney. He started giving things away, not in a dramatic way, just folding things up neatly before he left. He gave me his fishing rod on a Tuesday afternoon. Just handed it to me in the driveway and said, "You're the only one who'd actually use it." I laughed. He didn't really. Celeste spent those last months in what I can only describe as a low hum of anticipation. She wasn't cold to him. She visited. She brought food. She sat with him. But there was a background frequency to everything she did. A waiting. She talked about what she'd do with the yard, whether she'd sell the trucking company or keep it. She said she'd hire a manager. She researched real estate listings in the neighborhood where he lived, in the same breath as asking how he was feeling. I told myself I was imagining it. I don't think I was. Pops died on a Thursday morning in October. I was the one who got the call from the hospice nurse, because Celeste had silenced her phone the night before and never turned the ringer back on. I sat on the edge of the bed for a moment, just holding my phone, and then I woke her up. She cried. Genuinely, I think. Whatever else was true about her, she had loved him, in her way. The funeral was 3 days later. It was a Wednesday, overcast, the kind of pale gray sky that makes everything feel slightly unreal. The church was full. I hadn't expected that. I mean, I knew people liked him, but watching the pews fill up, men in their 60s who'd worked for him 30 years ago, a woman from his neighborhood who said he'd helped her through a bad winter by just showing up and fixing her furnace without being asked. The kid who ran the gas station down the road who'd apparently gotten a loan from Pops to cover his first month's rent when he was 19. It hit me differently than I expected. I thought about what it means to move through the world that way, quietly making people's lives slightly better and never keeping score. Celeste wore a black dress and stood at the front like she was receiving guests at an event she'd organized. She accepted condolences efficiently. She did not cry at the service. I noticed that. I think other people did too. Her brother Scott flew in from Denver and gave a short eulogy that was clearly written the night before. He was in and out, booked a return flight for the day after the burial. Celeste barely spoke to him. Whatever was between them was old and cold. The will reading was scheduled for the Monday following the burial. Pops' attorney, a man named Gerald Fitch who'd handled his affairs for over 20 years, ran a small practice downtown. We sat in a conference room that smelled faintly of old carpet and coffee. Celeste had dressed up. I remember that specifically. She'd worn the same kind of careful outfit she wore to job interviews, back when she still had them. Scott appeared via video call from Denver, clearly in a hotel room. Gerald Fitch was a slow-moving man who didn't smile much but wasn't unkind. He arranged papers. He cleared his throat. The estate, as described in the initial summary, was substantial. The trucking company had been sold 8 months earlier. I hadn't known that, to a regional logistics firm for just over $4 million. The house was paid off, valued at around $600,000. Various accounts, investments, a commercial property he'd held quietly for years. When Gerald Fitch finished the inventory, the total came to somewhere just over $5 million. Celeste exhaled next to me. It was a very small sound, but I heard it. Gerald Fitch set down the inventory sheet and picked up a second document. He said, "Before I read the distribution terms, I want to note that Raymond revised this document 14 months ago. It was witnessed, notarized, and reviewed by 2 independent attorneys per his specific request." Celeste folded her hands in her lap. I don't think she heard that part. Gerald Fitch read, "Scott received $400,000 outright, no conditions, as acknowledgement of his relationship with his father despite the distance between them." Pops's words, not the lawyer's. The phrasing was careful and kind and utterly Pops. $200,000 was divided among 4 specific charitable organizations: a local food shelter, a youth trades apprenticeship program, a hospice foundation, and the church where the funeral had just been held. $100,000 was placed in a separate trust, designated for the families of 3 former employees who'd been with Pops for more than 15 years and were no longer working due to health conditions. And then Gerald Fitch paused, adjusted his glasses, and looked up. He said, "The remainder of the estate, approximately $4.3 million, is held in a conditional trust with the following terms." Celeste leaned forward. Just slightly. But I saw it. Gerald Fitch read the conditions. The trust would be released to Celeste in full, but only upon 2 requirements being met simultaneously. She had to be actively employed, verifiably, not self-reported, for a minimum of 12 consecutive months, and she had to remain legally married. The room was very quiet. Celeste said, "I'm sorry?" Gerald Fitch repeated the terms. He was not unkind about it. He had, I think, done this before. "He can't do that," Celeste said. Her voice had changed. "He can't attach conditions like that. That's not how it works." Gerald Fitch said, "I'd encourage you to consult your own attorney, of course. But yes, conditional trusts of this nature are entirely legal. Your father was aware of that. The structure was specifically designed and reviewed." Celeste turned to me. I don't know exactly what she expected to see on my face. Whatever it was, she didn't find it. We drove home without speaking. I made coffee. She sat at the kitchen table staring at nothing for a while, and then she said, "He had no right to do that to me." I didn't say anything. "I'm his daughter," she said. "I'm his only daughter." I said quietly, "He didn't cut you out, Celeste." She looked at me then, and the look wasn't grief and it wasn't confusion. It was something colder, like she was calculating something she hadn't finished yet. She said, "I need you to leave." I thought she meant the room. I said, "What?" She said, "I need you out of this house. Tonight. I need space to think, and I can't think with you here." I stood there for a moment. We'd had arguments before, silences, distances, the usual friction of 2 people who'd grown in different directions. But this was different. There was a flatness to her voice I hadn't heard before. I said, "Are you serious?" She said, "I've already called a locksmith for tomorrow morning." I took what I needed for a few days and drove to my buddy Rafe's apartment across town. He asked me what happened, and I told him, and he didn't say anything for a long moment, and then he handed me a beer and said, "What are you going to do?" I said I didn't know yet. I stayed at Rafe's for 3 days. I called my sister, who lives in Phoenix and had never particularly liked Celeste. And she was careful and measured in a way that told me she was trying very hard not to say, "I told you so." I called my own attorney on the second day, a woman named Diane Polk I'd used for a contract dispute a few years earlier, just to understand where I stood. She told me that if Celeste filed for divorce, the conditional trust would be forfeit. She told me I had no obligation to leave the marital home, legally speaking, but that courts tend to look at these situations carefully. She told me to document everything. I didn't tell her about the conditions of the trust. I wasn't sure why at the time. In retrospect, I think I already knew something she didn't. On the fourth day, I went back to the house. I still had a key. She hadn't had the locks changed after all. Or maybe she had and forgotten to get me the new key. Either way, I got in. She wasn't there. I gathered more clothes, grabbed the folder of documents I kept in the desk drawer, insurance, joint accounts, the mortgage, and I sat for a minute in the living room that was still half full of Pops's furniture. Pieces she'd brought over after his house was cleared, and I thought about him. I thought about what he'd said to me the last time we'd had a real conversation, a few weeks before he got too tired for long talks. We'd been sitting on his porch, and he'd been watching the street the way old men do, and out of nowhere he'd said, "You know what the difference is between a man who works and a man who waits?" I'd asked what. He'd said, "One of them always knows what he's worth." I hadn't understood it fully then. I thought I understood it better now. On the fifth day, Celeste called me. Her voice was different from the night she told me to leave. The flatness was gone, replaced by something that tried to sound casual and didn't quite get there. She asked how I was doing. I said fine. She said she wanted to talk. I said okay. She came to Rafe's, which surprised me. She sat at his kitchen table and she talked for a while about how hard the last few months had been, how Pops's decline had been difficult for her, how she'd been under enormous stress. I listened. She wasn't wrong exactly. The last months had been hard. That part was true. Then she got to what she'd come to say. She said she'd been thinking, and she thought maybe she'd overreacted. She said she wanted to make things work. She said she'd been looking at the trust conditions, and she thought if they worked together on this, they could meet them. She could find something to do. A part-time thing, something to satisfy the employment requirement. And then after the 12 months, the money would release. I sat with that for a moment. I said, "What happens after the money releases?" She didn't answer right away. She looked at the table. Then she said, "We cross that bridge when we come to it." And there it was. The clearest thing she'd said in years. I thought about what Pops had done and why. I'd had days to think about it. He hadn't been cruel. That wasn't in him. He hadn't been punishing her for being who she was. He'd been trying one last time, with the only leverage he had left, to show her something she'd refused to see while he was alive. That there was a version of herself she kept choosing not to be. That the waiting, the years of waiting, had cost her more than money, and that if she could just do the work, just be in the world the way he'd been in it, she'd find something on the other side worth more than the number in the trust. He hadn't left her the money to give her comfort. He left it as a reason to get up. Whether that was fair, I still don't know. I think about that sometimes. Pops could be stubborn. He had a strong idea of how things should be, and he wasn't shy about engineering circumstances toward his vision. Maybe a different man would have just let her have it. But he wasn't a different man. He was the man who showed up at a neighbor's house in February with a toolbox and didn't ask to be thanked. I told Celeste I needed a few days to think. She said okay, and she left, and I sat there in Rafe's kitchen for a long time. Here's the thing I hadn't told anyone yet, including my attorney. I'd gone back to Gerald Fitch's office on my own 3 days after the reading. I told him I had questions about the trust structure. He'd been careful with me. I wasn't his client. Pops's estate was, but he'd given me enough. He'd confirmed that the trust conditions applied to the marriage as it stood at the time of the distribution. He'd also confirmed one other thing. Pops had named me as a secondary trustee, not a beneficiary. a trustee, meaning that if Celeste failed to meet the conditions within a specified period, 5 years, the trust would not default to the estate. It would transfer to me with a single designation to be used for community and charitable purposes in the spirit of the original charitable bequests. Pops hadn't just left Celeste a condition. He'd left me a role, a purpose. I don't think he'd intended it as a weapon. I think he'd intended it as a backup plan for his own values. If she came through, great. The money was hers, and she'd have earned it in a real sense. If she didn't, the work he'd cared about would continue anyway. I spent the next several weeks being very honest with myself. That's not easy, by the way. Honesty with yourself is harder than honesty with other people because you can't walk away from it. I had to look at my marriage clearly, not at who Celeste had been when I fell in love with her, but at who we'd become, and whether there was anything under the surface worth digging toward. I decided to go back to the house, not because of the money. I want to be clear about that, because I know how it sounds. I went back because I wasn't ready to end a decade of marriage based on one terrible week without at least trying. I told Celeste this directly. I told her what it would mean, what I needed to see change, not as conditions, but as what I needed to trust her again. I told her I knew about the trustee designation. I told her I wasn't going to use it as leverage. She listened. For once, she listened without planning her next sentence while I talked. I could tell because her face was doing something unfamiliar, something younger, a little frightened, and more real than I'd seen in years. She got a job, not a token thing, a real one, in the events department of a hotel downtown, which turned out to be something she was good at in ways she'd forgotten. I watched her rediscover that over the following months. Some mornings she came home tired and complaining, which was normal. And some mornings she came home with a story about something that had gone right, and those were the mornings I remembered who she'd been when we first met. It wasn't easy. Nothing about it was neat or resolved. We went to counseling for 6 months, which was uncomfortable and occasionally very hard, and which I think actually helped. She didn't become a different person, but she became more present in the one she was. At 11 months, she sat at the kitchen table one evening and said, without preamble, "I think Dad knew what he was doing." I said, "Yeah." She said, "I hate that he knew." I said, "That was kind of his thing." She almost smiled. It was the most genuine thing I'd seen on her face in a long time. The trust distributed at the 13-month mark, after Gerald Fitch's office verified the employment documentation. The number in the account was the number he'd left. She didn't throw a party about it. She paid off the mortgage. She put a significant portion in savings. She made a donation to the hospice foundation that had cared for Pops in his last weeks. That one was her idea. She didn't tell me about it until after she'd done it, like she was a little embarrassed, which meant she actually meant it. I still have the fishing rod. I use it maybe 3 times a year, down at a reservoir about 40 minutes from town. Nothing special about the fishing, honestly. But I think about him when I'm out there. The way he moved through the world without needing applause. The way he loved her even when she made it hard. The way he believed, right up to the end, that the best version of the people he cared about was still possible. He was stubborn about that. I respected him for it. I still do. I used to think karma was something that happened to other people. A concept for movies, for comment sections, for the kind of stories you share online and forget by Thursday. Then I watched my wife hand me a suitcase on the worst night of both our lives, and I started to understand that cause and effect doesn't need a dramatic score. It just needs time. Pops never lectured me. That was the thing about him. He didn't sit you down and explain his worldview. He just lived it, consistently, in ways that were almost boring to watch until they weren't. He showed up. He did the work. He treated people as if their dignity was worth something, not because he expected a return, but because he decided that was the kind of man he was going to be. Every single day. Without applause. What I know now is that the years I spent watching him were an education I didn't fully enroll in until after he was gone. He was trying to show me, and Celeste, that the way you move through ordinary time is the thing that defines you. Not the big moments, not the inheritance, not the dramatic decision points. The Tuesday afternoons. The choices you make when nothing is at stake and nobody's watching. Celeste had spent years waiting for the moment when the math would finally work in her favor, and I think somewhere in there, I'd been waiting too, waiting for things to get better on their own, waiting for her to come back to herself, waiting without doing much about it. There's a version of patience that's really just avoidance, and I've been living in it longer than I want to admit. What it cost both of us was real, not just the week I spent on Rafe's couch. The years before that, the slow erosion of something that had once been good. That doesn't happen overnight. It happens in small decisions, repeated. The conversation you don't have, the thing you don't say because it's easier not to, the version of yourself you keep putting off becoming. I'm not trying to make myself sound better in this than I was. I made mistakes. I stayed quiet when I should have spoken. I let things drift because confrontation felt like too much. And Celeste, I think she was genuinely lost in a way that neither of us had the vocabulary to talk about. Grief does strange things. Entitlement is often just grief that never found the right door. What changed things wasn't the trust. It wasn't the money or the conditions, or even the fact that she came to Rafe's apartment and asked me to stay. What changed things was that both of us, finally, decided to stop waiting. She went back to work and found out she was still capable. I went back to the house and found out the marriage was still worth trying for. Neither of those things was easy. Neither of them was guaranteed. Pops knew what he was doing when he wrote those conditions, not because he was punishing anyone, but because he understood something I've only recently started to believe, that the best version of a person is not a fixed thing waiting to be unlocked. It's built, slowly, by the choices they make when it would be easier not to. He left Celeste a reason to try. He left me a role that wasn't about money at all. And he left both of us the only thing that actually matters. A little more time to get it right. I still think about him when I'm out at the reservoir with that fishing rod. He wasn't a perfect man. He was stubborn, sometimes infuriating, and he absolutely believed he knew what was best for the people he loved. But he also showed up. Every time. In ways that outlasted him. That's the only legacy worth leaving.